The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share this stream, invite your friends and family to it so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion. This week, the chairman reads Chapter 3 from the book Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the political report to the 7th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, titled How the Party Survived Counterinsurgency, pages 63 through 116. You can find the study materials in the Facebook and YouTube descriptions. In this study, we will learn how the party, with its nearly 50-year history, survived the U.S.-initiated counterinsurgency, a war without terms waged on the Black liberation movement, and how, despite the difficulties of this period, the party was able to rise from the ashes of defeat to bring the Black revolution of the 60s back to life. We ask that throughout the study, you prepare your questions regarding the topic so the chairman can expound more on certain ideas. It is my honor to introduce the leader and founder of this party, the leader of the worldwide African Revolution, the person who carried the defeat of the Black Revolution on his shoulders and trudged forward to build the Vanguard Party that is leading the way in this struggle to overthrow this bloody social system. My leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru.
Uhuru Comrades. Uhuru. This is an important and timely study that we're engaged in. Counterinsurgency is happening all around us in various places in the world. We see it and sometimes don't know what it is we're looking at. Counterinsurgency, for example, in China is being referred to as the, how do they characterize it? The democracy, the pro-democracy mobilizations in Hong Kong. That's been extraordinarily disruptive to the Chinese economy and for many people, the image of China. That is clearly a contending force as far as U.S. and white imperialism is concerned. We look at counterinsurgency when in Venezuela, where the United States government is doing everything it can to starve the people into submission and at minimum to starve them into opposition, open opposition that can be turned into the overthrow of the existing Venezuelan government. We see it happening in Bolivia, where the United States just succeeded, at least temporarily, in initiating a coup that overturned the government of Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in Bolivian history. It was counterinsurgency in Syria, counterinsurgency even in Iraq today. We look at the activities in Iraq, and where massive mobilizations have been occurring. People, hundreds, I think, of people have been killed by the existing Iraqi government. Of course, when you look at Hong Kong, you're looking at an obvious opponent of the United States in the form of China that's contending with the United States for leadership, certainly throughout Asia, and Venezuela and Bolivia, where people have been breaking free from the U.S. domination, the so-called backyard, I think, is how the U.S. has historically characterized this area of the world. Iraq, which has been under the influence of the Iranian government, the government there, after all the United States did to overturn the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein, then even as it's opposed to a serious contest with Iran, the Iranians turn out to be the most influential force inside Iraq, and that's problematic. Syria is another place. You can just look all around. We saw counterinsurgency happen in Libya and various other places around the world. So this issue of counterinsurgency is really important. It's one that's not that easily been recognized when it comes to the struggle of African people inside the United States, because the success of the United States in promoting and preserving a kind of leadership in the African community that is based on the assumption that the problem that we have is that the United States there's racism here, and Africans are treated badly, and I guess that goes for Mexicans and indigenous people stuck in these concentration camps called reservations are treated badly, but the task is to make a movement that would have the United States treat us better, or to treat us as equal to the Americans. And so it's very difficult. It's been difficult for many Africans to grasp this. And this is only because the United States counterinsurgency has been so successful that forces like Garvey and Malcolm and to some extent even forces like the Black Panther Party, which was at its best a revolutionary organization that at its best recognized colonialism as a contradiction. These forces are no longer there. The only force that's struggled from that high tide of resistance in the 1960s is the African People's Socialist Party. And so we've been struggling for a very long time to win a recognition of the within the so-called African liberation movement of the existence and significance of the counterinsurgency that's been waged against us. So it's a really important discussion, and increasingly we are committed to helping our own movement, our own party, recognize the significance of counterinsurgency and issues related to security. Security of our organization, security of our leadership, security of our institutions that we've created, security of our communities, which colonized communities and subject to every kind of crime that government and economic institutions want to commit against us. So I want to go ahead and begin. And again, this is chapter 3 from the political report to the 7th Congress of our party, which in its book form is called Vanguard. And chapter 3 begins how the party survived the counterinsurgency. And it's important because in this discussion, we'll see that there's a class issue here that helps us to understand this. There's the question of national oppression of African people, colonialism, that helps us to understand this, and how the party has held up the African working class as the fundamental force that's not only going to lead to the liberation of African people, but the African nation itself. So on page 63, chapter 3, Comrades, since its inception in 1972, our party has been the only force that through theory and practice exposed the historical base both for the rise of the Black Power movement of the 1960s and its demise. We are the singular voice that waged tireless political struggle and fierce on-the-ground campaigns, showing that the demise of our courageous movement of the 1960s was brought about by a violent and devastating U.S. government counteroffensive known in military terms as counterinsurgency. The will to struggle and the heady confidence of the African working class feeling the power of its own leadership did not go out of style or lose favor among the masses as fabricated in the U.S. government's narrative of our defeat. By the mid to late 70s, almost all those so-called revolutionary African leaders and organizations inside the U.S. and around the world that had actually survived the U.S. government's murderous assault were now compliant with imperialism's myth about what happened to us and our historic liberation struggle. Contrary to the ruling class lies, the African working class did not suddenly develop a preference for heroin and crack cocaine, poverty, homelessness, police murder, and years in prison over self-determination and political power. We did not abandon our children or willingly turn them over to their kidnappers in the U.S. foster care and prison systems. We did not gladly give up our power and leadership to the African petty bourgeoisie, the neo-colonial class. As we have said many times, the African working class inside this country, which has been for centuries the revolutionary moral compass for oppressed peoples around the world, was now criminal, hated, and detested in the U.S. government's carefully crafted counterinsurgent plan. After more than a decade of concerted struggle, hard fought for victories were rapidly taken away, and the conditions of the African working class were soon worse than they had been before we rose up. Counterinsurgency is what the U.S. and imperialist powers of parasitic capitalism do to colonized people when we fight for our freedom and independence through revolution. The heroic people of Vietnam, Chile, Nicaragua, and African people in Congo, Kenya, and South Africa were among many others who bore the brunt of imperialist counterinsurgency. A counterinsurgency is a war without terms. When white people fight each other, they have the Geneva Convention defined as rules that apply in times of armed conflict and seek to protect people who are not or no longer taking part in hostilities. Though these include the sick and wounded of armed forces on the field, wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians, unquote. When they fight us, however, the Geneva Convention does not apply, and they do anything they want, including to civilians, the wounded, the sick, and prisoners of war. And I want to say that this is not because these laws that are created by the U.S. and other imperial powers are not important to them. They are important. But how they are applied and to whom is the thing that is significant, and their very existence is significance, these laws, these conventions, because they function more like political cover than anything else. For example, when the U.S. government was actively and initially engaged in a hostile war against people in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and what have you, they refused to characterize them, the people who they captured, as prisoners of war. They would call them some kind of combatants. And they would do this purposely and consciously to avoid coming into conflict with the Geneva Convention, which demanded certain kinds of protections against people who were prisoners of war. So they were not prisoners of war, they were some kind of armed combatants who were captured, and that made it all right for them to torture, and they did excruciating torture. They denied people anything that approximates democratic rights, and now we're talking about Muslims and Arabs who they were killing there. And the same thing has happened with us, African people in this country, who are not even, on the one hand, according to law, characterized as some kind of U.S. citizens, and therefore it's an internal issue of the United States. We are an internal issue here, and not subject to international law in that fashion. This is what they have done. So the law is important. It's a tool and instrument that they use like they want to use it in a way that serves their own interests. Almost 30 years ago, we summed up in my 1991 book, Black Power Since the 60s, the struggle against opportunism within the U.S. front of the Black Liberation Movement. That was the title. Quote, while ever present since our forced sojourn within this U.S. North American hell, this counterinsurgency has achieved a different character since its effective use during the Black Revolution of the 60s to destroy a movement for happiness and repossession of our stolen resources. Essentially, this counterinsurgency changed character from one which, while it attacked the whole African people, had its primary emphasis on the destruction of specific individuals and organizations, to one which has as its primary target the entire African people, especially the revolutionary African working class. So the counterinsurgency, while it's always active in terms of how laws and things like that and state apparatus, apparati? The state, anyway, attacks and governs and control African people, at the time of the heightened revolutionary movement, then we saw the counterinsurgency begin to target specific individuals and organizations. Kill Malcolm, kill King, destroy the Black Panther Party, revolutionary organizations, and what have you. And these are various components to the counterinsurgency. There are various components to the counterinsurgency. It employs every branch of the government and a host of state-connected institutions, as well as the bourgeois media and other instruments of mass culture controlled by the U.S. colonialist state and ruling class. It used the draft board. There was a thing that was known as the draft board, where every person in the United States over the age who had become 18 or older had to sign up for the draft. And so the U.S. government had this process of being able to use this as the means, this pool of people, to be able to put them into military service in the Army. And the draft board in the 1960s was used to draft African young men who were likely to participate in the African Revolution in this country and ship them off, draft them into the U.S. military, and ship them to Vietnam to fight against other colonized people there. Of particular significance to this discussion is the use of drugs and neocolonialism as components of the counterinsurgency. The impact of drugs on the African community is well known, if not even exaggerated. For several years, the white ruling class media have quite selectively overwhelmed our consciousness with images of drugged-out African mothers, African children who are born addicted, African illnesses and wretchedness which are due to drug use, and of course the violent African youths who are victims of and responsible for the torrent of violence and homicide that characterizes so much of our existence. Indeed, the media have consciously worked to criminalize the African community and people, mostly through manipulation of the drug issue. The selective usage of the media has defined the African in the popular consciousness, and this includes too much of the African consciousness as well, as a criminal entity suffering from self-inflicted ills that beset us, or as a community on the road to self-destruction. It is no longer the vicious colonial repression, as exemplified by the fact that more than a quarter of our male youth are tied to the prison system, or that the infant mortality rate within our colonized communities is at least twice that for white people, or the vicious police and white citizens' violence constantly directed at African people that defines our existence. It is no longer the economic exploitation that denies us work within the legal capitalist economy, while at the same time charging us more for shoddier goods, from housing and transportation to food and health care, that defines our reality. It is no longer the African oppressed by colonial white power, who we are aware of, but the thankless, criminally violent, drug-addicted African who has tried the patience of civilized white society for the last time. And indeed, drugs, violence, and crime do haunt our communities, but they do so as part of a vicious U.S. government-imposed counterinsurgency that is designed to crush any attempt by our desperate people to realize national liberation. This quote came from a book that was comprised of a series of articles and polemics that the party waged against within the African liberation movement to demand recognition of the existence of this counterinsurgency. And it was very difficult for us to understand why this struggle could not be won, except we had to conclude that primarily because this war that was initiated around the issue of drugs was targeting the African working class. And they did not have an analysis that suggested or presupposed the leadership of the African working class. Therefore, they didn't have to see what was happening as an attack on the African people. This was this deranged group of people that the leaders of the Black liberation movement generally held in the same contempt that the ruling class, that the colonizer did. I was looking at the blurb on the back of this book, Black Power Since the 60s, and I just read this. It says that the approach of our party has been to identify, and I think this is a quote from the book, the approach of our party has been to identify the counterinsurgency and all its obvious components as the primary contradiction, and to attempt to win all in our oppressed colonial community who can be won to struggle against the counterinsurgency, including the governmental importation of drugs into our community and the vicious war against our people in the name of a war against drugs. This approach makes the government the enemy and calls on everyone, including the penny-ante drug dealers, to unite against the government in every way, including the cessation of distribution and usage of drugs. The other approach makes the African youth the enemy and unites with the government campaign against them. It is precisely because of this theoretical reliance on the African working class as a social base upon which revolutionary struggle must depend that our party has been the only organization capable of targeting the counterinsurgency, which has the African working class, employed and unemployed, as the primary victim. The theory of our party informs us that without the conscious participation and leadership of the African working class, there would be no revolution. But because the counterinsurgency targeted the working class, none of the anti-colonial organizations was willing to recognize it. Most of them, some more than others, actually united with the counterinsurgency slander against our people and the so-called war against drugs initiated by Ronald Wilson Reagan and continued under the regime of U.S. CIA President George Herbert Walker Bush. And so we say only our party has provided a historic and class analysis of the development of the Black Revolution of the 60s that must be understood by militants and activists attempting to interpret the state of our struggle today. That's a very crucial thing because African people suffer national oppression, which means that all the people, and in fact you will hear those petty bourgeois forces who don't want to recognize the existence of class contradiction within the African nation, within the African community, they would say things like that. All of us, there are no classes here. The white man hates us all. We're all niggas where the white man is concerned, et cetera, et cetera. And effectively, that is true on the one hand, because we are oppressed as a nation. That's what colonialism does. It doesn't just pick the working class, it picks the entire nation. But it has created within the colony, within the entire economic and political structure that it is attached to, it has created a sector of our own community, of the African nation, and and given it a stake in the existing relationship. It has a stake in it. It makes money from it. Its family goes to school as a consequence of it. It benefits from it, even though it doesn't benefit like the white people or the benefit. It benefits more than Africans. So it has a material stake. This is not, and this material stake is more often than not reflected also ideologically in how they understand the world and how they approach every question. So you talk about a struggle for national liberation, where the whole nation, the whole African nation is oppressed. The whole African nation wants to change that. The whole African nation wants relief from that in some way or another. The whole African nation wants to end this oppression, but the whole African nation is not committed to overturning the system and is not committed to some restructuring of this relationship. Only the working class has a material interest in doing that. The working class does. And it's not to say that there are not sectors of the African population who have been militant nationalists, who've actually gotten engaged in armed struggle. And you'll find this throughout the world. You will see that forces fighting for national liberation, that when they're fighting this struggle, sometimes engage in armed struggle to end the oppression of the nation. For example, I remember the struggle in Venezuela, in Nicaragua stands out so much to me because as a party, we were very much involved in that struggle, and I could point all over Africa to similar things. But one of the Nicaraguan revolution was led by the Sandinista movement. The Sandinista movement at one juncture has split into 3 different tendencies. And on one occasion, when a leader of the Sandinista movement attacked the Nicaraguan parliament and held the entire parliament hostage until they released all of the political prisoners that government had held. And it was a very dashing and charismatic guy who led that. His name was Adan Pastora. And he forced the government and then loaded up all these political prisoners on the buses. And then there was Adan Pastora, who was known as Comandante Zero, who was riding and standing in the doorway of the bus as it pulled out, holding up his AK-47, dashing, charismatic, wow, electrifying vision. But Adan Pastora, he was opposed to the national oppression. He was opposed to the regime of Somoza that had been imposed on the people by the U.S. government, but he wanted to overthrow the Somoza regime so that he could have what the Somozas had, so that he could benefit and people like him could have the benefit. It wasn't for the people. In fact, he became an enemy to the revolution that collaborated with the CIA that eventually killed him when he could not get what he wanted. When the Sandinista revolution would seize like huge cultural centers, huge centers, and turn them over to cultural centers, turn them into cultural centers for the people. Edam Pastoris, this is crazy. This is supposed to be ours, right? And so he split, and that's what national liberation moves the entire African nation. The struggle for national liberation has that ability. It can cut across classes because the whole nation suffers some kind of oppression. But the question is only that there's a sector of the population, a tiny sector of the oppressed people, who have a stake in the existing social system and has no interest in overturning it. But the working class, that's why we say that there's a class struggle raging within the struggle for national liberation. That's why even as the working class, through its own revolutionary party, through its Advanced Detachment, moves to energize and push the entire nation forward in the struggle against national oppression, against colonialism on the one hand, on the other hand, fights for the power within that relationship so that the interests of the African working class not only survives, but becomes the primary interest that is realized. The African working class cannot be free if the African nation is colonized. But the African working class is the only sector that's capable of seeing this and fighting for the entire nation. The African petty bourgeoisie can only fight for itself. It might do so in the name of fighting for the nation. It can only fight for its tiny self. And so, anyway. So, the image in bold, no. Where am I? One critical point is the profound correlation between the historical events occurring in Africa and other places throughout the colonial world and the freedom movement of Africans inside the U.S. As I wrote in 1997 in the pamphlet, Why I Became a Revolutionary, quote, I'm fortunate to have been born in an era of great transformation in the world. It was a time when the basic social contradictions of this country became obvious for all to see, especially those contradictions which revolve around the so-called race question. The 1940s was also the era in which great movements against direct white rule or colonialism were occurring worldwide. In 1947, India achieved formal independence from England, and the Great Chinese Revolution occurred in 1949. Other revolutionary anti-colonial movements were sweeping Africa, Asia, and Latin America, unquote. It was this period that most defined how we understand the nature and character of our struggle today. The image and bold initiatives of Kwame Nkrumah, first president of independent Ghana, and the implacable stance of Patrice Lumumba are etched in the consciousness of all who look back at that era of universal struggle of African people. We were made confident in our road to liberation by the incorruptible visage of Malcolm X and the massive mobilization for democratic rights organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The scenes of courageous young Africans from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Hunter of militant organizations, and the Black Panther Party, to name just a few examples of high resistance of the time, leave many Africans at a loss. Why the current lack of direction for the mass movement today? Why the absence of universal opposition to our colonial domination as a people? Only the African People's Socialist Party has answers to these questions. The answers lay in the counterinsurgency. Bourgeois thinkers in this country have come up with a shallow explanation for the rise of anti-colonial liberation struggles during or following both the First and Second Imperialist Wars to redivide the world. The massive phenomenon known as the Marcus Garvey movement followed on the heels of the First Imperialist World War. While the second civil rights movement, while the historic civil rights movement rose up in the years following the Second Imperialist War, we characterize these as First and Second Imperialist Wars or World Wars. They're typically called the World War I and World War II. And that doesn't help us to understand what the hell that was. But both wars were wars that were fought by imperial powers to redivide the world, to redivide Africa, Asia, and to a lesser extent, of course, they didn't have to make that around the Americas because the United States was recognized as a dominant force in America and had put forth this thing they call a Monroe Doctrine that challenged any power from any place else from coming in and trying to partake in the bounty from the colony, this whole colonial territory of the Americas. So it says it's the First and Second Imperialist Wars, because there were no good guys in these wars. These wars were fought to redivide the world. And as an exception in terms of the good guy characterization may be the Soviet Union, which was a target of the Second Imperialist World War, a conscious target of the Second Imperialist World War by those who were fighting against the Germans, the Nazi regime, with the assumption that the Nazis, that the Germans and the Soviet government would do irreversible harm to each other. They wanted, in fact, they laid back. When the Germans attacked Russia, they sat back on their hands, wanting for the Germans to crush Russia or the Soviet Union that they saw as a major threat to worldwide capitalist domination. So if we suggest there was any good guys in that war, there's a possibility that we could characterize the Soviets as that, because they were targeted by all these forces to destroy the potential for any kind of workers' power. They tell us that African soldiers and other colonial subjects who participated in those wars in defense of our colonial oppressors were inspired by our first glimpse of freedom when we visited other lands as soldiers for the empire. This was a line that was developed, and I was taught this in school, and others may have heard this. I don't know if white people got the same line, but somehow it was our experience in Europe and other places as soldiers in the United States that showed us something and taught us what freedom was and could be, etc. So when we got back to the United States, we demanded it. And I imagine that logic would have applied to Africans who were coming from colonies and other places and fighting for Europe. There may be some truth to the fact that many of the colonized were able to leave our neighborhoods and villages and experience the larger world for the first time since white power took over our lives. Nevertheless, an understanding of the explosive and generalized growth of the struggles for national liberation in the U.S. and around the world must be sought beyond the self-laudatory explanations of the international colonial bourgeoisie. In fact, that's the way that they take responsibility for our struggling for freedom, because they taught us what freedom was when we went to fight for them in these wars. That's where we learned what freedom was. Historically, the colonial rulers have always implored their subjects to fight their predatory wars, whether between themselves or against other colonial subjects. The British used Africans from other African colonies in their attacks against the courageous Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, or Mau Mau. The Mau Mau successfully stood up to the British Empire for many years before the brutal, terroristic British counterinsurgency campaign was able to crush the heroic struggle in the 1960s. The French deployed troops from their various colonies in their vain attempts to defeat the magnificent life and freedom-affirming Vietnamese Revolution. liberating Vietnam from French colonialism. 71% of French troops fighting France's colonial war against the Vietnamese were actually subjects from Algeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other French colonies. When the U.S. entered that war on the side of the French imperialism in an attempt to maintain the colonial slavery of the Vietnamese people, it is said that 50 to 65% of the troops on the front lines were domestically colonized Africans, not to mention Mexicans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans, other forces also colonized inside the U.S. It is true that the participation of Africans and other colonial subjects in these imperialist wars did introduce thousands of us to contemporary military training and the invaluable experience of fighting under enemy fire without panic. This aided the anti-colonial armed struggles being waged in our own interest against our colonial oppressors. Participation in the U.S. wars also served to destroy the colonial myth of the courage and indestructibility of the white man, and even provided legal opportunities for actually killing him. White men could die at the hand of a lowly nigger. They could scream in pain, just like an African being burned to death by a white lynch mob in the U.S. This was instructive. The greatest value of the Second Imperialist World War for the struggle against colonialism, however, is the fact that the imperialist bandits who were in fierce struggle against each other to redivide the world meaning us and our lands, were unable to give our oppression their usual ruthless attention. The war had left many of the colonial powers exhausted and preoccupied. In some cases, the imperialists actually required the colonized to take on some of the colonial responsibilities previously in the sole control of the colonizer. All of this provided us political space that we, the colonized everywhere, used to organize against our oppressors. Inside the U.S., thousands of African people risked their lives and limbs fighting in the First Imperialist War for the interests and freedom of white people, only to be targeted upon return to the U.S. with lynchings, Jim Crow, unspeakable violence, and assault by those same white people after the war. Africans and colonized peoples worldwide faced a similar situation. As the fever for independence swept the colonial world, hungry for our own freedom and independence following the war, more than 11 million African people here and around the world flocked to the African National Liberation Movement led by Marcus Garvey. With the end of the Second Imperialist War, the world economy changed hands from the British, who up to that time controlled 25% of the world's population and territory, to those of the U.S. The myth of British tea-sipping white civility as the imperialist-in-chief was destroyed by the German bombing of London and other cities in England and by rising struggles for national liberation inside British colonies. Out of desperations following the war, the British made a call to their colonial subjects from throughout the world to come home, to rebuild England, thereby growing a domestic or internal colony similar to that in the U.S. Soon thousands of colonial workers were recruited to relocate to England to be exploited in the process of reconstructing the former colonial power that now lay in ruins. This influx of Africans and South Asians into the imperialist center initiated real class struggle that ruptured the facade of class peace. Previously, the unity of British workers with their ruling class had made it unnecessary to arm the English police. The internal class struggle in England had been smothered by the abundance of colonial booty that filled markets, dinner tables, urban department stores, and provided holidays and home ownership for workers and the bourgeoisie alike. Class struggle was also muted by the transfer of excess white population to the resource generating far reaches of the empire: South Africa, Kenya, India, Australia, Canada. Today, the British do not boast so loudly of a pacifist police department. Some of you may have read, I think it was on yesterday or the day before, there was a stabbing in London, ostensibly done as a quote-unquote terrorist attack, and even after the stabbing, it is said that the person who did it was captured, subdued by passers-by, people who were in the location. And after they had subdued him, the police came up, and the guy is out, and they have a video showing the cops shooting the guy even after he has been subdued. The people have subdued him and what have, and the British cops come up and shoot him and kill him right there. So this whole thing about the Bobbies of England and not carrying weapons, that was true for a long time, but as the class struggle is transferred from the colonies into England, you see the cops are more likely to be armed now than ever. While many colonies were able to win nominal independence through people's war, through people's struggle in the years following the Second Imperialist War, imperialist powers retained economic and political domination over African people. The imperialist strategy of neo-colonialism, of white power and blackface, carried out by the African and colonized petty bourgeoisie, proved to be an essential tool of counterinsurgency. So, you know, that's a really important thing to recognize, that Nkrumah talked about this neo-colonialism, where there could be flag independence, where the British and other colonial powers would participate in ceremonies, and where people could raise their flags and sing their national anthems, and at midnight, with this celebration at midnight, then the British, the colonizer, would hop on their ships and sail away, right? And that's why but they still owned and controlled all the resources. They still owned and controlled the economy. So even though they left, they still owned everything, and therefore through owning the economy, they can control politically what was happening on the ground, which is why that has been characterized everywhere as flag independence. So you got a flag, but that's about it, right? They didn't even do that in South Africa. South Africa is the most opportunistic place, perhaps, well, one of the most anyway. I don't know how you can quantify that. It's like, how pregnant are you? But South Africa, where the Negroes took the flag of the South African flag and somehow combined, that's the colonial flag. That's what South Africa was, the colony. The white people there, the colonizers, they're a settler colony, took the flag and combined it with the flag of the colors of the African National Congress, or the African Liberation Movement, and came up with one flag. And still retained, of course, the colonial name of South Africa, which is just extraordinary. The U.S. did not suffer the consequences of the war being fought within its domestic borders and became the center of the capitalist world economy. This is reflected in what is known as the Bretton Woods Conference, the 1944 United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which established the World Bank and International Monetary Fund that relocated the center of the world capitalist financial system to the U.S. So the IMF and the World Bank came out of that Bretton Woods thing, and this was the center of the international capitalist system is now located in the United States. And this is interesting because the Chinese now offer one of the big challenges to the domination of the IMF and World Bank with their international, international industrial, is an international industrial trade entity, but it's an economic system that has connected much of Asia, Australia, even, which the U.S. tried to prevent from joining this, and other countries. And it is a big threat. I mean, it's struggling, at least if not to relocate the economic system of the world, to create another one that can contend with the existing system now under the leadership of the United States. The European imperialist power were now forced to share with the U.S. their previously dominated markets and resources from their colonial bounty. Raw materials from the colonies that were opened up to U.S. exploitation began to generate a critical need for U.S. workers to transform them into finished products. Workers from Eastern Europe, having become part of the Soviet Bloc after the war, were no longer available to the U.S. as in the past. This is where the party provides the only materialist analysis of the rise of the civil rights movement, the basis for where it come from. You know, I mean, Martin Luther King made a good speech and practiced Gandhiism or some nonsense like that. You know, it's what we usually hear. And so now that the U.S. Has access to these markets that were previously dominated by European colonial powers, now that the European colonial powers themselves have been crippled severely, and in fact, the United States puts forth this thing that's called a Marshall Plan that is designed to rebuild Europe, but it also makes it necessary for U.S. to have open access to all these European markets and resources in the colonies. And so now you have all these resources coming to the United States, raw materials and what have you, and the United States has to solve the problem of where we're going to get the workers, you know, to handle this. And in the past, the workers, when there was a worker shortage, they would get them from white countries and like in Eastern Europe. And, you know, Hungary was one place, and that's where even the concept of the hunky came from. It was other white people who called Hungarians who were competing for jobs and stuff the hunkies. And so that's how that, you know, developed. Now, with the end of that war, these countries in Eastern Europe are now part of what was referred to as the Soviet Bloc. This was something that was recognized as the Soviet sphere of influence. Coming out of that war, there were certain territories in Europe were recognized in Eastern Europe as a Soviet sphere of influence. And some of them are actually brought into what was characterized as the Soviet Union itself. So these workers that used to be available to the United States for factories and stuff are no longer available. Because of the Soviet Bloc. And it's really interesting because when the Soviet Union collapsed, then there was a great cheer among the bourgeoisie here because there was an assumption that there were going to be all of these workers now who are available, who are educated, highly educated, because they were educated through the Soviet system and what have you, highly educated, who can now become a part of the labor force in the United States. And that some of that did happen. That's why, you know, you could go into department stores here in the United States and pick up this heavy accent and say, where are you from? And they would say Albania, or they would say someplace in Eastern Europe and what have you, because it freed up those. But then it couldn't happen. So the bourgeois solution for the U.S. worker shortage was located in the southern states, among the domestically colonized African working class. The problem was that the relations of production in the South required Africans to be tied to the intense, backbreaking toil associated with the labor-intensive capitalism in jobs such as sharecropping, mining, and agricultural work. This is where African labor was concentrated. And at this time, the convict leasing still existed. So you have all this African labor that you got to liberate. You got to liberate this labor so that it gives it more mobility, so that it's available to leave the South and go to capital-intensive areas of the country, and also to work in the factories that will be opening up in the South. That was a huge struggle. And it was a struggle because, it wasn't just a struggle because white people didn't like Africans. It was also a struggle because the economy of the South, the rulers of the South required slave labor of the African population. And so to say that these cats can go to school, can do all these other things, made them a part of a contest that challenged the political and economic domination of the capitalists in the South. Why were Africans denied education in the South? In part because education, what is education? In any society, except the process of providing workers with enough information and knowledge for production and for reproducing the philosophy, ideology of the social system. That's what education is. And get rid of all that fancy stuff to make people capable of production. So what production was necessary for, what education was necessary for production for picking cotton, for digging ditches, for doing all the dirty work that was to do? You don't want that African to have any other kind of education, because that presupposes knowledge of the things that would make this African a dangerous person to the actual social system that you have there. So that's why it wasn't, you know, that was the basis for it. And why would Hubert Humphrey and these northern forces want Africans to have education? Because they needed Africans to be able to work in the damn factories. And you need a minimum amount of education to function in the factories, beyond what you would need to pick cotton and chop tobacco and all this other stuff that we were doing in the South. And that meant it was a great contest between sectors of capital in this country, and Africans, in some instances, could be characterized as fodder for this battle that was happening between them, except it was in the interest of African people to achieve some element of democracy. It's better to go to court and be lynched than to be lynched, you know, by the nearest tree. And so people were fighting for the right to be lynched in court, as opposed to be lynched by the nearest mob of white people that got together. At least in being lynched in court, often had, did not carry with it the subjective, often the same kind of subjective viciousness that you found from your average white mob, I guess. So it was for these reasons that African laborers were denied the right to the minimum education that would be necessary for workers in the capital-intensive production in northern factories. This is why the liberal U.S. bourgeoisie supported the nonviolent efforts to legalize education and basic civil rights for the oppressed African workers in the South. This is why they would support the nonviolent. This is why this is the basis for philosophical nonviolence being something that was supported by the liberal bourgeoisie everywhere. The Africans were not going to fight, going to suffer any kind of injury inflicted on them, and then somehow the morality of white people was so challenged that Africa would achieve some form of freedom. That was the concept that was applied. So the apartheid regime in South Africa was influenced and built on the same relations of production that existed within the U.S., where Africans were totally disenfranchised and defined as subhuman. There was such a thing as nigger work that placed restrictions on where Africans could work and what we were permitted to do within those workspaces. So that in this city even, there was a time where Africans could not be employed as drivers, driving trucks and working for the city and what have you, because that placed them higher up than white people who, you know, etc. So Africans couldn't have those kinds of jobs. Africans were denied the right to do those things. And so separate toilets, drinking fountains, and neighborhoods were also used to define Africans as less human than the North Americans or whites who set the standard for human identity. And what happens is when you establish these kinds of relationships, everybody begins, so many people begin to believe in them, even the people who are subjective to the humiliation. I mean, there was nobody standing with a gun at the water fountains in downtown St. Petersburg, Florida, where one said colored and one said white, and the colored stuff was always shabby, and you had colored toilets when there were toilets for Africans, etc. But it was demeaning. There was a sense that to be with the white thing was to be human. To go to the colored thing was to be less than human. So in many ways, Africans were fighting for humanity when they were fighting to be where the white people were, because this was defined as human. And this is how it got to be defined. The colonial state, which included the white population in the South, also initiated deadly prohibitions on all social interaction, especially sexual, between the colonizer and the colonized, essentially between African men and North American women. These deadly prohibitions involved massive government-sanctioned lynchings, human burnings, torture, white mob attacks, destroying whole African towns, rape and general degradation of African people, for which, as of the 1950s, no white perpetrator was ever prosecuted. A crude but generally accepted ideologically backward definition of African humanity was a logical expression of the economic base of a slavery-generated social system. It is a definition that prevails up to this day, not only for Africans within the U.S., but for Africans in general, all of whom were brought into a relationship with Europe through the global colonial slavery-related economy. Nor is this backward ideological assumption restricted to what are generally regarded as reactionary, Klan, Boers, or fascist type of Europeans or whites. We're talking here about the ideological foundation of capitalism that permeates all of Europe, other capitalist-dominated societies, and essentially the entire world. Happy Christian families, liberals, and cookie-baking grandmothers all embraced this ideology and carried out this violence. African workers attempting to leave the U.S. South for the capital-intensive production of the North often had to do so under extremely dangerous circumstances. In many instances, Africans risked their lives to acquire the education necessary for laborers in capital-intensive production. These contradictions led to the alliance between members of the liberal sector of the colonial bourgeoisie, as represented by U.S. Senator and Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphreys and former U.S. Presidents John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the liberal colonized African petty bourgeoisie. Both needed change and access to African workers, but for entirely different reasons. Both needed a revolution from above, that would not overturn the entire colonial capitalist system. The African working class, perennial victims of this terror and arbitrary legal, extra-legal, and often very subjective personalized violence, desperately needed relief from this situation. We wanted to be able to see a future where our children would not be locked into indeterminate, relentless brutality with poverty and back-breaking nigger work. The colonized liberal African petty bourgeoisie also needed democratic changes for its own protection from this arbitrary extrajudicial treatment. Even petty bourgeois, educated and otherwise assimilated Africans were subjected to the vicious whims of uncultured, uneducated, reactionary whites who function as an extension of the white colonial state in their treatment of Africans. And what happened often is that the invention of the uppity nigger. This was the African with the temerity to own property, to have education, or to refuse to act normal, that is to say, according to how this thing is supposed to work. They characterize as uppity. And you would see many of the lynchings that happened in this country And the attacks on the African community were based on the fact that Africans had accumulated resources. That was not permitted. In fact, you had the concept of white trash, too. And white trash was characterized as such because here you are white, and you are supposed to be successful as compared to Africans who are here. And you know, in the South, there was, you know, this was a demeaning characterization of white people as trash. You were white trash because you were unsuccessful, and sometimes not as successful as the African who everybody knows is at the bottom of everything. So even African petty bourgeois forces found themselves being victimized by this. I mean, by terror, by any individual white person. Individual white person come up and say that this nigga just looked at this white woman or touched this white woman or thought about this white woman. In fact, there were legends about something characterized as reckless eyeballing, looking at a white woman, you understand? That could result in death, something else horrible. So the petty bourgeoisie suffered from this as well. That's something that's it's on TV now. I haven't looked at it. Something that happened, I think, in the 50s. Story of a woman named, her last name is McCullum, out of Live Oak, I think it was, Florida. I knew of this case. It was really interesting because she had gone into this white doctor's office in a segregated joint and shot him up, killed him and everything. So they eventually arrested her, tried her, put her in prison. And then she escaped from prison. And then while she was escaped and she was sending letters to the sheriff often, you know, laughing at him, and then she sent a voodoo doll of the sheriff with pins and things stuck in it. This guy was terrified. Was it Lizzie? Her name was McCullum. And, but she was the wealthiest woman, African woman, in that city, and had been apparently having an affair with this white doctor. And he thought, I guess, that she was a white woman with whom you could get away with certain stuff, and she came in and she shot him, killed him, and what have you. Anyway, yeah, they locked her up. She broke out of prison, escaped on her own. I guess it was on her own. I mean, how the hell? Maybe the same people who helped Assata, you know, was there. But anyway, the point is, even the petty bourgeoisie was subject to this terror. And so these democratic rights were something that that everybody wanted to have. There was a common interest in achieving them. So additionally, the selfish interests of the African petty bourgeoisie required mass access to the electoral process as a means of acquiring an ability to integrate into the capitalist economic system, which is the definition of equality for the African petty bourgeoisie. To be able to get into the capitalist system is the definition of equality. They needed the African masses to have the ability to vote so they, the African petty bourgeoisie, could be elected to office and positions of power to integrate into the capitalist system as co-predators. These petty bourgeois forces became the burgeoning neo-colonialists. Many had no neo-colonialist aspirations. Often they merely wanted to be part of the existing setup. Some, suffering severe self-alienation, just wanted to be with white people. The revolution from above that we have come to know as the civil rights movement was funded by the liberal white colonial rulers. This explains why the movement had to be based on philosophical nonviolence. The white rulers were not about to fund a movement that might engage in armed resistance to white terror that might destroy our colonial domination. As we analyzed in the book, East Relate to Africa, the political report to our third Congress back in 1990, the alliance between the liberal oppressor and the liberal oppressed was an alliance which required a limited or partial revolution. This partial revolution would result in the oppressed African working masses being able to sell their exploited labor to the liberal bourgeoisie and would give access to electorally gained white power to the African primitive petty bourgeoisie. Along with the natural aspiration of the oppressed, domestically colonized African people for national liberation, this was the real political and economic basis of the civil rights movement that mobilized and gave consciousness to millions of African people throughout the U.S. and the world. This was the real political and economic basis for the heroic existence of the wretched, toiling African masses of the South. Both the white liberal oppressors and the oppressed liberal African petty bourgeoisie were determined to obscure the actual material basis of the struggle known as the civil rights movement and the real stakes that were involved. Both were determined to keep the masses of African people convinced that we were struggling to change the feelings of white people toward Africans, or that we were fighting for the right to live with the white oppressor nation, U.S. North American population. Thus, a purely idealistic, ideological cover was given to our struggle by the liberal African primitive petty bourgeoisie. We were not told that we must be committed to philosophical nonviolence because we were involved in a limited revolution designed to serve the interests of the liberal sector of our colonial oppressors who would never support a genuine revolution of our oppressed people. Instead, we were told that such a philosophical commitment to nonviolence was morally cleansing and empowering. However, there was always an undercurrent of resistance to the philosophical idealism, tactics, strategies, and political objectives of the liberal African primitive petty bourgeoisie from the broad perimeter of the black liberation movement. Much of this resistance came from the masses of oppressed African working people who sometimes participated in the movement despite these differences, unquote. The problem for the white rulers and their compliant African minions was the fact that the leaders for this movement, the impoverished and brutalized, the problem for the white rulers and their compliant African minions was the fact that the fodder for this movement, the impoverished and brutalized Africans of the southern U.S., would discover our own interests in the struggle for the democracies being sought by the liberals, colonized and colonized alike. In the struggle to change the world, these African toilers would ourselves be changed. We sum up in the article Advanced Detachment, written for the Burning Spear in 1985, and which appears in the book Omali Yeshitela Speaks, quote, during the 1950s, the alliance between our movement and the liberal bourgeoisie consolidated itself in mass struggle. In the process, our movement began to achieve a revolutionary character. This movement activated the African victims of U.S. colonialism as conscious participants and impacted on the consciousness and practical life of all the people inside the U.S. This powerful movement overthrew the immediate form of capitalist rule of the southern white ruling class and achieved legal democratic rights for African people, unquote. So the need for change was aptly summed up by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in its slogan demand for black power, coming in 1966, after the petty bourgeois-led civil rights movement had realized its aims with the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The outcome of the alliance was, quote, something that neither the liberal bourgeoisie nor the black petty bourgeoisie could predict, namely the emergence of an African proletariat rising up from the bowels of America itself, as we observed in Advanced Detachment. While the selfish interests of the African working class proved to be in contradiction with the aims of colonial white power, they were in contradiction with the interests and aims of the black petty bourgeoisie as well. We noted again in Advanced Detachment an inconsistent, though generally materialist philosophy of black nationalism began to emerge out of the aims of the African working class. Black nationalism began to reject the idealist and obscurantist philosophy of the liberal black petty bourgeoisie. Martin Luther King's dream of a better day in America as a consequence of the moral regeneration of whites of the oppressor nation, was challenged by the nightmare as defined by Malcolm X. The African proletariat, facing objective reality in America, raised the demand for black power to determine our own black reality, unquote. Indeed, the Black Power slogan demand captured the reality for the entire African nation within the U.S. and the world. Inside the U.S. during this period, every African community was literally on fire with rebellion and anti-colonial resistance. It was an anti-colonial demand that challenged the limitations of the so-called equality and rights within the colonial relationship. The Black Power demand gave a taste of political power to the masses of African people everywhere. As we contained in Advanced Detachment, quote, for the new generation of fully mobilized African workers that was thrust onto the scene as the main social factor in U.S. political life, his aspirations were far from being met by gaining legal democratic rights. The attempts by the petty bourgeoisie to moderate the black liberation movement, to decelerate it and direct it towards liberal bourgeois democratic sops, were met with cries of burn baby burn in Los Angeles and black power in Mississippi. At this point, the independent aspirations of the African working class became clear. This new clarity fueled efforts to build independent political parties by and for the colonially oppressed African population. It was interesting because in 1965, I was in Los Angeles, California, when the Watts Rebellion occurred. In fact, like the song by Ma Barely, I woke up in a curfew. Africans had risen up in this sector called Watts. And it was an incredible happening. And they brought in King. It was really interesting. And he came to Will Rogers Park to speak. And he got booed off the platform by the Africans there. They booed him off the platform. And they brought in Dick Gregory, who was telling the people, trying to tell the people to cease their fight, take the women and children home, and they shot him. Africans shot Dick Gregory. So I mean, it was something happening here. This whole contest between the struggle, this dream of King and the reality that Africans were experiencing, this whole commitment to philosophical nonviolence, it was not something that was universal. In fact, I think most Africans were determined to fight back given an opportunity to do so. Quote, this is from the Advanced Detachment. For the new generation of fully mobilized African workers, that was thrust onto the scene as the main social factor. I got that, didn't we? So we explained further in the 1998 presentation that we call The Wolf and the Double-Edged Blade, published in Omali Yeshitela Speak, quote, a movement emerged as an anti-colonial movement at the moment when the issue became one of power. When African workers said black power, they united with struggles like the ones being led by Che Guevara throughout Latin America and Africa. In 1967, we saw the rise of the Black Panther Party, which took the struggle even further. The Black Panther Party was immediately and explicitly informed and influenced by Malcolm X, who told us that since it's legal to have a shotgun, every African should have one in his or her house. With the emergence of the Black Panther Party, we saw the tremendous anxiety in this country, so much so that J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the executive director of the FBI, which is one of the secret political police agencies in this country, characterized the Black Panther Party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States since the Civil War. Not Gaddafi, not Saddam Hussein, not the Russians, but ordinary African working class folk, most of whom lived in housing projects and had to use public transportation to get from one part of the city to the other. That's a statement about where power can be found in the masses of African workers and poor people who, given organization and ideological clarity, can achieve anything. That's the thing that Hoover and the FBI recognize. Unfortunately, not too many of our leaders today recognize that. We know that the Black Revolution We know that the Black Revolution, once unleashed, gave rise to virtually every other progressive entity that sprung up in this country. It was the Black Revolution that took white women out of the kitchen and homosexuals out of the closet. It was the Black Revolution that energized the movement of other oppressed peoples, including indigenous people in this country. It was a powerful and profound movement that shook this country to its very foundation. This is why the government put in place a program to cut down and undermine the Black Revolution and assassinate our leaders. They created what they refer to as counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency uses every form of attack: psychological warfare, actual armed struggle, economic warfare. The name of the government's counterinsurgency against the Black Revolution was COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. COINTELPRO was the program used to assassinate and imprison our leaders and destroy our organizations. I want to say that we're going to say something now about COINTELPRO briefly. But I want to say that the COINTELPRO program by the FBI was just one of the counterinsurgency programs that were active. There were military intelligence entities that were working against our struggle, and then there was also the CIA that, in violation of U.S. law, was actually working on the ground in this country to attack the African Revolution. And in fact, it had a program called Operation Chaos that it initiated in 1967, the same year that COINTELPRO, and within weeks of the COINTELPRO counterintelligence program by the FBI. This country employs an army of assassins. There's a new book out called Poisoner in Chief that I would ask people to look at. And it does a relatively good job in talking about how the United States government organized scientists in this country, various other kinds of entities, and created whole bases. Fort Detrick is a place that where it was Camp Detrick, where they had whole bases where all they did was work on torture, chemical and biological warfare. They experimented on this all the time. I want somebody also to help me, because I am convinced that there was in Cameroon several years ago a village that was where all the people and the animals in that village were killed. And the explanation that they gave was that some gas came from the lake and killed everybody, but that's BS. I mean, this government, I can't remember the year now, but these scientists that I'm talking about, they wanted to test the ability to use chemical warfare against an entire city. So they went to San Francisco, to the bay there, and they had these ships out there that would spray this chemical over San Francisco. And they dyed it red so that they could track it. They went to San Francisco because the fog and stuff would help to disguise what it was that they were doing. I think they were minesweepers that they used to do this with. And it covered 800,000 people. San Francisco, the whole city of San Francisco, they showed it affected the whole city of San Francisco as well as Oakland and other areas around the San Francisco Bay. I mean, so, they have organizations that's just these scientists that are supposed to be so noble. I mean, one of them, the one who headed up this thing, well, people in here are too young to remember Dr. Strangelove. But this character in Dr. Strangelove is, assumed to be based on this real living character, Gottlieb was his name, Sidney Gottlieb. And he was dedicated primarily to coming up with new poisons, mind control stuff. They took people who worked for the Nazis and torturing and killing Jews and what have you, experimenting on them. After the war, they brought them in, they hired them and brought them into the United States. They took Japanese who participated in torturing and people and poisoning and doing all kinds of horrible things. They hired them. And then they used much of what they brought into it. But of course, what this book does not talk about is the torture and experiments that they already knew about what they had done to Africans and indigenous people here. I mean, it was Americans, it was the white people here who gave the smallpox-infested blankets to the indigenous people. It was they who would perform surgeries and things like that, experiment on Africans. It was the United States that went to Puerto Rico and got women there that they tested the birth control stuff on. So this whole notion, it's true what Gottlieb did, but that doesn't that doesn't begin to get to what this country's done. But it has a battery of science that, if you can call it that was achieved through torture, experiment on live people, freezing, see how long it would take somebody to freeze to death, to cut them open, to just commit all kinds. And then LSD is something that they introduced to the world, and using LSD, experiment as a mind control entity. So that's what this force is. And one problem that we have is that most people don't even have the ability to imagine what this government does and will do to people. But I want to find out about that Cameroon thing. So imperialist violence sets back our anti-colonial struggle. I'm just going to read a little of this and then we'll end it for today. The COINTELPRO objective spelled out in this August 25th, 1967 memorandum sent by the FBI to field offices throughout the U.S. is telling in its slander, lies, and efforts to criminalize and set the black revolution up for violence and assault. What do they call it now? Black something kind of extremists. What is it? Black identity extremists, right? So they're going to commit a horrible offense. So they give us this characterization as black identity extremists, right? And this is an issue of domestic terrorism, as how the FBI has defined it. So here is the memorandum, August 25th, 1967, sent by the FBI to field offices throughout the United States. Quote, the purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize the activities of black nationalist hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, membership, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. This is what they're telling the field agents, and this is, even when this is something that is revealed, say, well, that's a pretty good thing to do. The activities of all such groups of intelligence interest to the Bureau must be followed on a continuous basis so that we will be in a position to promptly take advantage of all opportunities for counterintelligence and inspire action in instances where circumstances warrant. The pernicious background of such groups, their duplicity and devious maneuvers must be exposed to public scrutiny where such publicity will have a neutralizing effect. Efforts of the various groups to consolidate their forces or to recruit new or youthful adherents must be frustrated. Excuse me. No opportunity should be missed to explore through counterintelligence techniques the organizational and personal conflicts of the leadership of the groups, and where possible, an effort should be made to capitalize upon existing conflicts between competing black nationalist organizations. When an opportunity is apparent to disrupt or neutralize black nationalist hate-type organizations through the cooperation of established local news media contacts, or through such contacts with sources available to the seat of government, which is Hoover's office, in every instance, careful attention must be given to the proposal to ensure the targeted group is disrupted, ridiculed, or discredited through the publicity and not merely publicized, unquote. This is the memo. So I just wanted to share that we can follow up with this on next week. But I wanted to say this is one of the reasons why how we do political work is so important in the kinds of organization we have. This is one of the reasons why we cannot and must not, as a party, despite what anybody else does, we cannot engage in slander. We have political struggles. We cannot engage in slander. We cannot engage in gossip. We have to really have an aversion to gossip because this feeds the enemies of the revolution, the intelligence agents who come into our organization, and they're here. And you know, we've been attacked on 1,000 different times. I mean, I can go back ages, and just in terms of kinds of attacks, especially as it revolves around gossip, because most people don't understand things like criticism and self-criticism. So it's either blame and avoid blame, and especially in an era such as this where you have these reality shows where people, you know, the Jerry Springers and all this kind of stuff, where it's just nastiness is what sells, and everybody learns how to do that. And there are some attacks that we have never even responded to, because to respond to them is to legitimize this, not just the persons and groups that might make the attack, but it helps to undermine the validity of the African liberation movement itself, to engage in certain kinds of struggles and discussions. I mean, I'm sure some of this stuff happened, but you go back and you look at struggles that led, you know, I mean, Lenin at one time, somebody said he was stealing the money. I mean, but you don't go back and you see struggles, the Cuban Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, where this kind of nastiness and gossip was able to define what the revolutionary movement was about. I mean, it's petty kind of stuff, and we say that our movement, we can't treat the movement as petty. Other people can attack us, but to engage with that kind of gossip stuff is petty. This Black Power since the 1960s that was written here is nothing but polemics against the organization. It's polemics that we have made around this whole question of counterinsurgency. Why can't the Republic of New Africa see this? Why can't the New African People's Organization understand this struggle that we're involved in? We struggle with the AAPRP. There's a book that we did, Smash Slander and what was it? And Build Principle, what? Unity. Attack slander, but there was nothing in there about any kind of garbage, no gossip or anything like that. We have to be intolerant of that. I'm saying this not just to everybody in our party should understand this. That's why it's hard to get a discussion from me when you just want to talk about somebody on some personalized way, because everybody, we don't have a relationship with people because of some personality stuff. We have political relationships, and this is what I even tried to say when after Huey was assassinated, and we did much around his funeral and in his memory, and people had characterized Huey as a bum, and when I say people, this is the bourgeoisie, and used all other kinds of things about him. And Huey had been beaten up for more than 22 years and demoralized to a point where he did engage in activities that many other demoralized Africans have been engaged in. But the oppressors, the people who were writing these articles about him, they were not attacking him, but for that, they were attacking him for what he did with the revolution. They were attacking him because even today, you see people who stand up and try to be like Huey P. Newton, or they thought Huey P. Newton was, as it represented the revolution. You got many posers today, power to the people, and other kind of stuff like that. But because that was representative in the minds of many people of what the revolution was. That's what the imperialists are attacking. When they're attacking, they don't care about who you sleep with. When they talk about King and who he slept with, they don't give a damn who King was sleeping with. They care because people followed him, and they thought if they said something that he was sleeping with this person, that person, they could derail that movement, that political movement. So we cannot find ourselves engaging in slander and in gossip, about any persons, about any organizations, or anything like that. We have political differences, and that's what has to dominate the discussion that we're going to have about and with them. So I want to say that. And so I think I've left ample time, I think, for discussion. I didn't do that so well last time out, I think.
Uhuru, let's salute our leadership, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, for that powerful study. It is now time to open up with questions from our audience and online viewers. We want to appreciate everyone who's tuning in via Facebook and YouTube, and also appreciate all of your engagement. Please continue to invite your friends and family to this study and share widely on all of your social media platforms. Want to shout out some places that are watching or where people are viewing from. We got Clearwater, Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, Tampa, Florida, Fort Myers, Florida, Roselle, New Jersey, Rotterdam, Netherlands, Chicago, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, St. Joseph, Missouri, Huntsville, Alabama, Richmond, Virginia, Hempstead, New York, New York, Oakland, California, San Diego, California, Kuwait, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Boston, Massachusetts, and Delhi, India. So Uhuru, shout out to everybody watching from all over the world. Chairwoman Penny Hess of the African People Solidarity Committee says, Uhuru, saluting Chairman Omali Yeshitela from the African People Solidarity Committee. We have Morty from Virginia is viewing on YouTube and wants to know, can you explain how the bourgeoisie uses holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, etc. to maintain African working class unity with white nationalist ideology and false national consciousness?
Say that again. Can you explain what?
Can you explain how the bourgeoisie uses holidays like Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, etc. to maintain African working class unity with white nationalist ideology and false national consciousness?
Uhuru. Yeah, where did that come from?
Morty in Virginia.
In Virginia. Uhuru. Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And it takes us back, takes us to this whole issue also of national identity and national consciousness, because actually these things that are characterized as holidays function to consolidate a sense of sameness that one could characterize as nationalism. And African people find ourselves having access only to these kinds of holidays, are often victimized by. I mean, I can walk through a department store or a mall or something and hear these Christmas carols and stuff, and it can evoke some nostalgic memory from my childhood even today. And that's what it's all about. And of course, if you know anything, and most people don't, like about Christmas, and I'm not just talking about the amount of money that our folk are going to throw away around it, but there are other holidays as well, the Easter stuff, and you get fed this stuff even as children and what have you. I mean, in South Africa, I'm here and looking at Christmas trees and, you know, the fat white Father Christmas guy and what have you. It's mind-boggling. Just as this is a struggle to diminish and undermine a sense of sameness or confuse Africans and other people in terms of acquiring a sense of sameness as a people and having us identify more with the colonizer than we do with ourselves. And these are some of the symbols. This is what you do when you achieve state power. And sometimes on the road to state power, you begin to create these holidays significant to yourself. That's what Garvey movement did, you know, and there are certain holidays that came out of that movement of more than 11 million African people and other kinds of symbols like flags and what have you. You can see them reflected throughout the African world today. I mean, the colors of the flags. You can even see one of them in Libya, but by reactionaries who fly the red, black, and green now there as well. So the thing is that that's part of what achieving state power allows us to do. And I remember reading how the guy who is considered the father of Italy made the statement after, I guess, consolidating the territory that we have now created Italy. We have created Italy, now we must create Italians. And that's what this project is about too, achieving a sense of sameness, national identity, and having our own, you know, like holidays that extol freedom and you know, liberation and what have you. So yeah, that's what that's about. It does function to have the colonized unite more with the colonizer than with ourselves. That's a statement of how much power that has been taken from us at this point. Uhuru.
Uhuru. We have, well, Process is the username on YouTube, is tuning in from Boston, Massachusetts, and asks, can you speak on the popularity of seemingly new buzzwords like white privilege, white guilt, and white fragility?
White fragility? Yeah. It's not new. This whole white privilege concept is not new. I mean, we made struggles with that going all the way back in the I think it was 80s, where we were engaged in struggle, because this whole notion of white privilege also assumes that the struggle that you're involved in is within the system to either negate the privilege of white people as compared to other people, et cetera. And it's a way that it obscures the colonial question. I mean, and here is a problem for some, is that the colonizer is white. The colonizer, those who are colonized. That's a social aggregate kind of benefit from being the colonizer. And the colonized is African, black, colonized is Mexican, the colonized indigenous people, you know, et cetera. And so this notion about white privilege is simply recognition that the colonizer has rights, and those who are not colonized do not have rights because we are colonial subjects. And so there is no way to equalize that relationship. As long as there's colonizer and the colonized, there's going to be this relationship that we're talking about. So therefore, the struggle cannot be against quote-unquote white privilege, but to overthrow colonialism, which is that which will empower the African as it relates to whites and anybody else in the world. And, you know, then white people can get jobs like everybody else, or try, you know.
There was a comment that was written in Spanish on YouTube, but we were able to get it translated, and I don't know the person's name, and I don't think I could pronounce the, you said you got the name?
What is the name? And where does it come from?
I'm not sure where it comes. They didn't say where they're located, but it was translated to say, Uhuru Chairman, your analysis of Black power and the conditions that motivate it, as well as how to understand it, is excellent. And
what is the name again? Lava what?
Lava pies.
Okay. I didn't hear that, but it's okay. Yeah, go ahead, Comrade.
And we're still waiting on questions. Okay. We got one from Nasir Al-Amin, watching from Kuwait. What is a simplistic and concise way to articulate the concept of socialism to our people who are deeply entrenched in capitalism?
Well, people are deeply entrenched in capitalism because it's the dominant social system in the whole world. It's not easy to not be deeply entrenched in capitalism. But the simplistic way is that socialism is a system that destroys the existing system or contradiction of the working people, the socialized, of contradiction of socialized production. That is to say, people produce collectively and socially, whether they're in the same city or the same country, socialized production on the one hand, but then you have private ownership of that which is produced on the other hand. So although the masses of people are necessary to produce what we see, what we live in, what we live with, etc., just a handful of people who don't produce anything actually own and control all of that. That's the profound contradiction. They control the society, they control the resources, etc. So socialism is the socialized ownership and socialized production. That is to say, those who produce own, and socially. Those who produce socially own socially. And those who produce and own socially are also the ones who are the authority in the society, as opposed to those who don't produce anything and own everything. I hope that was all right. Yeah, Uhuru. Yeah.
This question comes from Comrade Tachara in St. Louis. It says, Uhuru Chairman, why have sectors of the African liberation tendency within our movement found it so difficult to acknowledge the counterinsurgency?
They've found it difficult to acknowledge the counterinsurgency. That is to say, because the counterinsurgency attacks most immediately and severely the African working class. And the party of the African working class can recognize that. But what you will find right there in St. Louis is people who claim to be revolutionary, claim to be for the people and all of that. They generally unite with the definition of the conditions of the working class that the rulers themselves put forward. So something is wrong with the working class. That's why I say the problem is that the working class is evil. Like we've got a city council person or ward alder person in St. Louis calling for the National Guard to be sent into the African community in St. Louis to stop black people from killing each other. And so now the National Guard is coming to help us, right? And it doesn't allow them the ability to see that the conditions that in our community are created by colonial relationship that we have to the whole government. And that what has to happen is not to send the armed National Guards into our community, but to arm the people. Arm the people with revolutionary science, and arm the people with organization, and fight for return the resources that's been stolen from our people. So most of them have not been able to do that. That's why we've had struggles all up and down the line, even up to now. I mean, I've read from you, to you, from Black Power since the 60s. This was published, I think, in 1990 or 1991. And that has never been, it has never changed. When the move got bombed in 1985 or 85, was it? 85, when the move bombing happened in Philadelphia. I mean, we had the first African Liberation Day, that is the party did, that ever happened in Philadelphia in defense of MOVE in order to expose the damn counterinsurgency. Why did this happen? We couldn't even get most of the sectors of the National Liberation Movement to come into Philadelphia after that bombing to unite to expose the counterinsurgency. And so it is because they have not recognized, generally speaking, the significant counterinsurgency because it's not the petty bourgeoisie that's affected directly and immediately by that. So I think that's primarily what it is. The Party of the African Working Class was able to do that and defend the interests of the African nation and the working class. Yeah. So
we are winding down to the end of the hour, but I did have one question, or more so really wanted you to talk about, especially in this, we're dealing with counterinsurgency, and just really want to appreciate Comrade T'Challa, who is in St. Louis, and our movement is engaged in a really serious struggle around the development of this geospatial agency happening right in the heart of the African community in St. Louis. So could you talk a little bit about that struggle and, as it relates to counterinsurgency?
Yeah, well, St. Louis is, right now, in many ways, it's true all around this country. I mean, we see it right here in St. Petersburg, Florida, how they move out entire populations. And St. Louis, there's a real serious attack being made on the African population. And part of what they're doing is they're placing so-called National Geospatial Intelligence Agency Center in St. Louis. And they've taken 97 acres of population, of property. They put families out of their homes. Sometimes people live there for several generations to take that property for the campus of this National Geospatial Intelligence Agency entity. The NGA, as it's called, controls the satellites, almost every phone that's called that you make and what have you. The NGA assesses that, computers and the whole thing. The NGA is an entity that they use for example, in Yemen, where the Saudi Americans are killing all of these people and what have you, they use the satellite imaging, et cetera, to do that from the NGA. The NGA is responsible, like missile drone strikes that's used in various places against people. The NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, does all this stuff. If you go and look them up, you will get this kind of cheerful description that it was there. They made mistakes during Katrina because they could see everything that happened with Katrina. It helps to discover lost people in different places and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's an intelligence agency. Intelligence agent, that's what it is. And so it took 97 acres of property from African people, pushed them out. Now it's taken another 900 acres around that where the campus is going to be. So 1,000 acres of land in the African community property. And then when they put the geospatial, this geospatial intelligence agency on the ground, it's going to raise the property value of all of the Africans in that general community, which means that more Africans are going to lose their property because they can't pay the taxes, which are based on property, on the value of the property. And St. Louis is engaged in an overall comprehensive kind of program. First of all, they would put this genocidal wreaking institution in the heart of the African community. Then they promised that we're going to give you all some jobs. We do this. We've heard that story before, right? But even the notion that you can get a job if you participate in killing all oppressed people around the world is what they're doing with that. And also it means that any retaliatory act against that thing targets the African community in St. Louis. So anybody who wants to fight them, would be targeting the African community in St. Louis. It is something that is supported by the national government, by intelligence organizations, by state government, and even these persons who in the city government. I mean, the city government has given them $130 million. That's from the city government alone. $130 million. This thing is, I forgot how many billions of dollars that goes into the geospatial thing. And part of this, of course, the intent is to turn St. Louis majority white. And so even as they're doing this, they are pushing a process in St. Louis that will reduce the number of wards in St. Louis from 28 to 14. So that 14 that carry much larger territory. So it's harder for somebody to run for office and win because you're going to need much more money to do that. And the whole thing is going to be so reconfigured that they can, you know, minoritarize, if you will, the Africans in various of the wards. And then they're fighting to change the city ordinance that prohibits hiring cops from outside of the city limits so that they can hire white people who function more, you know, even more as outside invading military force. And they're combining the county and the city to, again, to neutralize the African population. So the potential for any kind of economic political power is under assault there. And it's a spy station. It's an international spy station. And so, you know, we want everybody to know about that. This is counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency directed against the world. Counterinsurgency directed against the African population. And it's one that we're organizing against in St. Louis as we are having this discussion now. Real organization is happening. People are being, today there was an important meeting that will be happening in St. Louis. And we are organizing the Power to the People Alliance, I think it's called, where people who've been victimized, who pushed out of their homes will be a part of this, as well as we and other people who we can bring into this process.
Uhuru. Thank you so much, Chairman.
Uhuru.
Because of time, we want everyone to know that if your question was not answered, one of our moderators will correspond with you and make sure that the chairman sees your question. This study was brought to you by the Department of Agitation and Propaganda, Winning the War of Ideas. For your revolutionary news and analysis, visit theburningspear.com. For revolutionary radio, dynamic shows, and music by Africans all around the world, tune in to Black Power 96.3 FM, broadcasting out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and accessible via the Black Power 96 app for Apple and Android, or online at blackpower96.org. Did you unite with what you heard today and want to learn more about how you can get involved with the African People's Socialist Party? Visit apspuhuru.org for all information regarding how you can apply. Order your copy of Chairman Omali Yeshitela's latest book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, The Political Report to the 7th Congress, at burningspearmarketplace.com. Time is running out. Sign up for the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise taking place December 14th through the 19th. The Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise is the annual fundraiser held to support the work of the African Socialist International. The African Socialist International is an organization made up of African people located virtually on every continent, dedicated to overturning the conditions faced by African people worldwide. Our cruise destinations are Half Moon Cay, Bahamas, Nassau, Bahamas, and Freeport, Bahamas. You can enjoy political education on board with the chairman, on and off-board excursions, and more food than you can eat. To book your trip, visit uhurulegacycruise.org or call the travel agent, Linda Stern, at 732-972-4171. If you want to further support the ASI and the Marcus Garvey Legacy Cruise, make a donation by visiting uhurulegacycruise.org. Start preparing now for the African People's Socialist Party's 2020 plenary following our 7th Congress, happening February 1st through the 3rd in St. Petersburg, Florida, themed Vanguard Up, Unity of Theory and Practice. You can register and read the call to the plenary today at apspplenary.org. On March 27th through the 29th, 2020, the African National Women's Organization will be holding the Black Women's Convention, Sisters United for Revolution, in Philadelphia. Registration is open for this dynamic event at ANWO, that's anwobwc.eventbrite.com. Come see the leadership of revolutionary African women doing the work for our freedom, being on the front lines for revolution. Featured Featured there will be presentations from African women in our party and movement, workshops, culture, and so much more. For more information about the convention, visit convention.anwouhuru.org. The Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations is hosting its 4th annual electoral campaign school in St. Louis, Missouri at Aquaba Hall, 4101 West Florissant on April 10th through the 12th, 2020, themed The Ballot and the Bullet. The school is a means by which the coalition opens up a new front of struggle for Black self-determination within the U.S. and elsewhere. The school will teach ordinary Africans, workers, activists, women, and youth how to run for office. The weekend of events will include presentations from members of the BIB Steering Committee and other special guests. Stay tuned to blackisbackcoalition.org for more details, including registration and our list of featured speakers. Thank you all for tuning in. Make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.